This is an International Women in MS session talking about COVID-19 and MS on July 1st. Happy Canada Day if there's any Canadians online. We are going to have now Dr. Billioux from the NIH present information and data about COVID-19 infection and vaccination. So, Jeanne, you can grab the screen.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so thank you so much for having me to speak. Like Emmanuel mentioned, I am a neurologist at the NIH. My specialty is in neuroimmunology and neurovirology, but I focus more specifically on emerging infectious diseases, particularly on a global level. And as such, I also am often a medical officer in NIAID's emergency responses. And so that means that I've recently been involved in one of their COVID-19 treatment trials, and maybe that's perhaps why I was asked to give this talk. So I will do my best, but I am not a treating physician for COVID-19 patients. So some of the information that I give is really just what's out there in the literature and so on and so forth, and it may not reflect exactly what's going on in your home institutions. So just to kind of have that caveat. So we all know the background of the novel coronavirus outbreak, which was estimated to have started in November 2019 in Wuhan. What I wanted to point out is that yesterday marked the 6-month anniversary that the WHO was notified of this mystery pneumonia, which I thought was pretty interesting. But the actual causative organism, SARS-CoV-2, was identified only in January of 2020. Since then, we've come to know much more about COVID-19 and that it causes significant morbidity and mortality, particularly in certain populations. And it's rapidly spread to the rest of the world. A pandemic was declared in March, and to date, we have over 10 million cases worldwide with over 500,000 fatalities. So pretty serious. And due to the extent of this novel pathogen, the world has been clamoring for therapeutics and vaccines. And that leads to a pretty interesting landscape of therapeutics for this disease. There have been a lot of repurposing of old medications, which I'll get to. There has been novel therapeutic development, particularly monoclonal antibodies. And there have been numerous clinical trials and data-driven assessments. Really, they're just multiplying daily. But a lot of these clinical trials have been somewhat inconsistent. Just to note, there have been, if you look at clinicaltrials.gov, and this was actually earlier on in June, there were over 1,200 studies found for interventional studies involving COVID-19. Unfortunately, there's really been a paucity of randomized controlled trial data. The news has often sensationalized some of the different findings that have come up in the literature. And then of course, politics kind of throws a bit of a ratchet in at certain times. I don't need to describe to you some of the interesting things that have come up with the US leadership at times helping fund certain treatments and at times will say sensationalizing others and stockpiling some, which can be problematic for the rest of the world. So with this novel disease, there have been a lot of repurposing of old medications, and that's been done at least in part by looking at different medications that may have had some effect on similar types of viruses, such as SARS-CoV, MERS, and then other kinds of coronaviruses. And you can kind of see a long list of different medications here. And this is actually kind of an older schematic, I believe from even March, of some of the medications that are being evaluated based on some of these other diseases, as well as cell-based assays and things like that. Another way that researchers have been looking for repurposing medications is through proteomic analysis to see what medications could have some effect against SARS-CoV-2. And here's another kind of an interesting schematic based on that. This is kind of the way I think of COVID-19 therapeutic strategies. Of course, because it's a virus, there are lots of antivirals that we're looking at, or at least medications with antiviral properties. There are a number of immune-based therapies because as we know about COVID-19, it causes a pretty significant systemic immune response, and sometimes even leading to a veritable cytokine storm. which causes multi-organ system dysfunction. So to combat that, there have been a lot of immunomodulatory therapies that have been looked at. In addition, there's also immune therapies that have targeted antiviral effects. And then there are other medications that are also being evaluated based on SARS-CoV-2's other effects, such as it's known, or we're knowing more about its hypercoagulable tendencies and also tendencies to damage lungs, so on and so forth.
So Jeanne, can I interrupt you just for a second? We are on a slide that may not be advancing. So somehow I think there might be a discrepancy between what you're talking about and the slide we see. So the slide we see is landscape of therapeutics in the time of COVID-19. Is that the right one?
No, that's not. It should be right now. Whoops, we should be on antivirals and antimicrobials. So maybe I'll end the show and try it again. Right here, I've just compiled a large list of the antivirals and antimicrobials that are currently being evaluated just by looking through the clinicaltrials.gov, and then also taking note of some of the ones that I'm very aware of. But this is not a complete list, and you may be aware of other medications that are being evaluated in your own patient population. I'm not really sure. But just to quickly run through, there's remdesivir, which of course I'll get to in a little bit, and it's been largely in the news. There's Kaletra, a protease inhibitor used in HIV. Favipiravir, a broad spectrum antiviral that's been used in lots of different viruses. Tamiflu, and another anti-flu medication, Arbidol. Ribavirin, which is used in Hep C and other viruses. Tenofovir and NRTI, used in HIV. Ganciclovir and CMV. Alpha interferon, used in Hep C. Galidesivir, another broad spectrum antiviral, which was previously tested in Ebola, among other things. Moraviroc, an entry inhibitor in HIV. Clevudine, which I believe, Hep B, Miramipidib, and isoprenazine, which is kind of a combination antiviral. And then these are actually non-antivirals, but antimicrobials, which are being evaluated for antiviral properties. I don't need to tell you guys about hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. I'm sure it's been all over the news. But other antimalarials are also being tested, including atovaquone, mefloquine, artemisinin, some different antibacterials, including azithromycin, clarithromycin, doxy, and also antiparasitic medications, including ivermectin, nitazoxanide, levamisole, niclosamide. And then these two, camostat and afamostat, are not even antimicrobials, but they're serine protease inhibitors, and they particularly have activity against TMPRSS2, which is a particular protein that aids, that SARS-CoV-2 uses to facilitate entry into the cell. So they have, they're thought to have some potential antiviral properties against SARS-CoV-2. So I'll just go over a couple of antivirals that have, that are more pertinent, including remdesivir. So this, like I mentioned, it's broad spectrum and it's a viral RNA-dependent RNA polymerase inhibitor. It was initially developed for use in Hep C and later tested in Ebola without evidence for efficacy. And I was actually involved in that trial, the PALM trial. Since then, there have been several trials for use in COVID, including a study in China, which did not reach full enrollment. And then Gilead Simple studies, which compared the 5-day versus 10-day courses. But the most kind of interesting trial, we'll say, of all of these is the ACT-1 trial, which is the adaptive COVID-19 treatment trial. It's a double-blind randomized controlled trial that was sponsored by the NIH and involved 60 trial sites across 10 countries. And the patients who were enrolled were randomized 1-to-1 to remdesivir versus placebo. Randomization was stratified by study site and disease severity, and the primary outcome was the time to recovery. The results are that over 1,000 patients were randomized, and remdesivir patients had a shorter time to recovery of 11 days compared to patients in the placebo arm, and this was significant. Mortality at 14 days was 7.1 in the treatment arm and 11.9 in the placebo group, but this was not statistically significant. So this is the first medication to really show with clear definition a benefit in COVID-19 treatment, particularly in moderate to severe cases. But unfortunately, Gilead just recently came out with their proposed cost of this medication, and it's $3,000 for a typical patient. So you can imagine that this is not a particularly going to be a particularly cheap medication, nor will it necessarily be easily available to people across the globe. And this, of course, is a pandemic. So there, I have a little, some qualms about that. That said, there are many different people who have noted that they thought that that remdesivir would actually cost more. So I'll hedge my disappointment. So I'll briefly touch on hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, and this has been very much in the news all over. It's been controversial because there have been a number of small trials or non-randomized trials that have been suggesting efficacy in a number of different patients, whether they were hospitalized or post-exposure prophylaxis and so on and so forth, with just the same number of trials that have also kind of stated the opposite. There was also a Lancet article involving a very large data set that noted that there was no efficacy with hydroxychloroquine, and more notably also might have caused more arrhythmias in patients who were treated with hydroxychloroquine, but it was subsequently retracted due to doubts of where the data came from. But more recently, there have been a number of randomized controlled trials that have come out that have really kind of, I think, started putting the nail in the coffin for hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. So recently there have been a randomized controlled trial from McGill showing no benefit as to post-exposure prophylaxis, although this trial did have a couple of issues related with it. And pretty recently, the recovery randomized control trial, which I will describe a little bit more later, showed no clinical benefit in hospitalized patients. There was also an NIH study called the ORCID study, which was halted after their DSMB recommended it was unlikely to benefit patients who were hospitalized. And then kind of unrelated, or somewhat related, but not exactly the same, and another NIH study that was stopped due to poor enrollment to show efficacy. And then also recently in mid-June, the WHO stopped its hydroxychloroquine arm and their Solidarity trial as well, based on the evidence from their trial as well as other trials. So there are still several ongoing trials. So the jury is not completely out, but there's not a lot of positive data that's being shown for hydroxychloroquine, despite all of the different hype that hydroxychloroquine has received in the recent past. So other antivirals worth noting, Kaletra, which is the lopinavir-ritonavir combination, has been shown in 2 different randomized clinical trials, no clinical benefit in hospitalized patients, although this medication was really given pretty widely at the very beginning of this outbreak because it was available, it was previously used in SARS patients, and so on and so forth. Another medication that's been used in a lot of different, more recently emerging viruses is favipiravir. It's broad spectrum. So far has not really been clearly shown to have any clear effect, but right now it's in phase 3 trials. Also, oseltamivir also has been used very broadly, but so far there's really no randomized data. And despite the fact that it's been given widely, there isn't really any clear effect that I was able to really tell. So that kind of brings me to the COVID-19 treatment guidelines that have been put out by the NIH recently. And its summary recommendations under its antiviral headline is that there are no FDA-approved drugs for the treatment of COVID. That said, they do recommend, based on the Act 1 trial, that remdesivir is given for the treatment of COVID-19 patients who either require oxygen therapy or are ventilated or on ECMO. So that brings me to some immune therapies. Like I was mentioning, we do know that SARS-CoV-2 can really cause a very bad cytokine storm, and whenever the cytokines are specifically looked at, it seems that IL-6, IL-8, interferon gamma, and GM-CSF tend to be the cytokines most remarkably elevated in severe COVID-19 patients. So to combat this cytokine storm, a number of immune therapies are being looked at. And this, again, it's a list that I compiled from the clinicaltrials.gov, but again, I don't know that it's particularly exhaustive. Not surprisingly, there are a number of IL-6 inhibitors, including tocilizumab, which has garnered a lot of attention. Also, IL-1 inhibitor, anakinra, canakinumab. I will probably not try to pronounce all of these names just because I am not familiar with all of them. But we have TNF blockers with infliximab, a lot of JAK inhibitors that are being evaluated, including baricitinib, some GM-CSF inhibitors, BTK inhibitors like ibrutinib, TARC inhibitors, CCR5 antagonists for lymphocyte migration. Even PD-1 inhibitors are being evaluated, as well as some of our older players like methotrexate, cyclosporin, tacrolimus, colchicine, and even some other anti-cancer drugs like etoposide are being evaluated for this. We mentioned a little bit in steroids, particularly I was interested to hear about Maria's results with steroids, but I'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. So steroids in the treatment of COVID-19 have had a lot of, again, a lot of controversy. There have been many studies that say steroids are beneficial and plenty that say that they're not. But steroids haven't really been carefully evaluated in a randomized controlled trial until the recovery trial in the UK. And so this information just recently came out. It's a large, the recovery trial, first of all, is a large multi-center randomized open label trial of possible treatments for patients admitted to the hospital with COVID-19. And these patients are randomized to treatment with either lopinavir, ritonavir, low-dose dexamethasone, hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, tocilizumab, convalescent plasma, or no additional treatment. So in the dexamethasone arm, there were over 2,000 patients given 6 milligrams of dexamethasone, either IV or orally, for up to 10 days, compared to 4,000 patients who received standard of care. And at 28 days, the mortality rate was significantly reduced in patients either on ventilation or receiving oxygen. So specifically, I want to note that 29% in the dexamethasone arm who required ventilation, the mortality rate was 29% in the dexamethasone arm and 40% in the standard of care. So that's a pretty significant difference in the patients who are requiring ventilation. In the patients who required oxygen daily, the mortality rate was 21.5 in dexamethasone and 25% in standard of care. And there was no survival benefit observed among participants who did not require oxygen at enrollment. And I just want to really quickly point out, I don't remember the exact mortality rate in the ACT study, but it's much lower than what's remarked on here in the recovery trial. But the ACT trial did also, of note, disclude some of the patients who had, say, kidney failure or liver failure and things like that. So that's why the ACT-1 trial likely had a lower mortality rate overall. I think the treatment, was 7% and maybe 11%, something like that. So based on these recommendations, the NIH COVID-19 treatment trial, treatment guidelines rather, have changed their recommendations to giving Decadron or dexamethasone rather, for 6 milligrams up to 10 days in patients who are either mechanically ventilated or requiring supplemental oxygenation. Other immune therapies worth noting, like I mentioned, the IL-6 seems to be a big player in the cytokine storm of COVID-19. So anti-IL-6 medications have been really big, most remarkably tocilizumab, which has been used in a number of small prospective studies or case reports that seem to confer positive results, particularly in severely or critically ill patients, but there has really no large randomized controlled data to date. However, there are several in the works, and this is the same with sarilumab and siltuximab. Anakinra has also been shown to be positive in some case reports, but we, again, don't have any randomized controlled trial data to really tell whether or not it's useful information. And then convalescent plasma is another, immune therapy worth noting because it confers passive immunity. And this is a very old kind of therapy. I think convalescent plasma is reported to have been used back in the 1890s in treatments for diphtheria, and since then has been used in the Spanish flu and more recently in Ebola. but there's really not a lot of great hard data to tell whether or not it's useful. It's been given in tens of thousands of patients so far for COVID-19. And so far, we only have one randomized clinical trial that was out of China. Unfortunately, it did not reach target enrollment because of the control of the pandemic in China. So they weren't really able to show any effect of convalescent plasma versus standard of care. However, it did seem that their results were trending towards being positive. There are some other randomized controlled trials, like it was mentioning, recovery is still underway, and so hopefully we'll be able to have some more information with those trials. That brings me to monoclonal antibodies. So they're not commonly used in infectious disease treatments. A couple that have been used are in RSV, anthrax, and C. diff. And more recently, there have been some success with the PALM trial and the DRC with monoclonal antibody 114 and Regeneron EB3 against Ebola. And so there are a number of monoclonal antibodies in the works for COVID-19. And basically, all of these monoclonal antibodies tend to be neutralizing antibodies that are typically targeting conserved areas of the spike protein. And they're either developed using patients who have, like the convalescent plasma of patients who have already had COVID-19 or immunized mice. And then these antibodies are isolated using phage displays or single cell B sorting and things like that, tested whether or not they're neutralizing, and then mass produced and used for testing. So they're kind of all in the early stages at the moment, but as of June 1st, Lilly, in partnership with AbCellera and NIAID, is the first to begin its monoclonal antibody therapy for COVID in a phase 1 trial, which is called LYCOV555. And others are in the pipeline or just starting. Phase 1 trials, including the Chinese Academy of Science study. There's an AstraZeneca and Vanderbilt cocktail that's about to be studied. And then also Regeneron and the University of Maryland School of Medicine cocktail, which I believe is in phase 1 trials already. So other therapies that I'm not really going to go into too much, but I briefly mentioned anticoagulation. There are a number of trials of different anticoagulants in COVID-19, particularly in more severe cases. As we know, there tends to be this this inflammatory milieu, and also we've seen lots of issues with hypercoagulability in COVID-19, and so anticoagulation is often needed in these patients. And whether or not a prophylactic anticoagulation is useful or not, we just need to figure that out a little bit better. There are also a number of therapies for lung-related issues and oxygenation targeting therapies. We do know that COVID can cause some pretty significant lung scarring, and so there are some different medications being looked at to try to prevent that, and also for helping with oxygenation. Some include Vazegapant, which is the CGRF receptor antagonist used in migraines. Sildenafil we know well, and also pamrevlumab, which is a connective tissue growth factor inhibitor used for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. There are a number of herbal supplements being evaluated, as well as vitamin therapies, and I won't really go into those too much. There's also some overlap with MS therapies, and perhaps you guys know a little bit more about this as possible treatments for COVID, and that include beta interferon, because as we know, this does have some antiviral activity. Fingolimod, more for its immunomodulatory actions, and also leflunomide, which in addition to its immune modulatory effects, has been shown in prior, say, cell-based studies to have some antiviral properties. And then I know that I've come across a number of case reports of MS patients who have been on different therapies, including Tysabri, who, despite getting COVID, have actually done pretty well. And so I'd be really curious to hear, maybe your experiences with some of these patients. And so I'm briefly going to go over the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. As you guys know, vaccine development is a priority. Recently, there's been Operation Warp Speed, also the active coalitions. These are private and public partnerships to try to get these vaccines developed more quickly. Warp Speed is also a Department of Health and Human Services and the Defense Department cooperative initiative as well, again, to help try to get these vaccines developed more quickly. At the moment, as of a draft WHO landscape announcement that was put out just a few days ago, there are 17 candidate vaccines in clinical evaluation at the moment, 1 in phase 3, 2 candidates in phase 2, and the remainder in phase 1 or 1/2, and 131 candidate vaccines in preclinical evaluation. So the vaccines that are currently in clinical evaluation include non-replicating viral vectors, RNA vaccines, inactivated vaccines, protein subunits, DNA vaccines. And then in preclinical, there are also all of those, as well as some live attenuating vaccines and also VLP vaccines. And as of yesterday, there has been some recent FDA guidance that came out that vaccines need to be at least 50% more effective than a placebo in preventing the disease. So I think that's pretty interesting, because it just means that even though we have this warp speed going on and everything, the vaccine actually does have to be effective. And this 50% is a metric that is often used in flu vaccines, just to give you an idea. So I'm going to present the 2 vaccines that are kind of near the top of actually being on the market. So the first one is the mRNA 1273 vaccine, which is a vaccine developed with Moderna and the NIH Vaccine Research Center. It's an RNA vaccine, and this is basically means that it's snippets of engineered mRNA that encode pre-fusion stabilized form of the SARS-CoV spike protein to elicit immune response within the host body. These RNA vaccines are very quick to develop and produce, but there are no RNA vaccines on the market as of yet. So we really don't know whether or not they're truly effective, whether or not the immunity that they do produce is going to be durable. We don't know much about RNA vaccines just yet. So it'll be really interesting to see. So the phase 1 for this particular vaccine was started in March, and the positive results were announced in mid-May. The patients seemed to have a decent immune response and few side effects for the most part. Phase 2 is ongoing, and they received an FDA Fast Track designation in May. Phase 3 is planned to start in June and enroll 30,000 patients across the US. The other vaccine that's kind of closest to being phase 3 rather is the ChAdOx1 vaccine, now called AZD1222, which is a vaccine developed by AstraZeneca and Oxford. And it's a chimp adenovirus backbone, a non-replicating recombinant chimp adenovector, which delivers genetic material of SARS-CoV spike protein. The spike is then again, kind of like in the mRNA vaccine, produced by the host and elicits an immune response. Their phase 1/2 was kicked off in April, and they currently have a phase 2 in the UK, but because the cases in the UK have quieted down a whole lot, they have actually had to start the vaccine trial in Brazil as well to be able to meet enrollment. Phase 3 is approved and planned for August. There are a number of vaccines that are also being very close to being in phase 2 trials. They're just kind of on the heels of these 2 different vaccines. But I wanted to kind of mention this tortoise and a hare. These, say, RNA vaccines and DNA vaccines are apparently very, very easy to develop and also produce. But like I said, we don't really know much about the durability of these vaccines. We don't know much about how effective or how strong the immune response elicited will be. So it could be that these kind of make it to the forefront very quickly, but what the vaccines that end up being the most effective may be the ones that take a little bit longer to actually be developed, such as the protein-based ones, the live attenuated ones, vaccines that we're a little bit more familiar with by vaccine companies that are more used to making vaccines. So we shall see. I think there's a lot of questions at the moment, but hopefully we're on our way to answers. And as you know, there's new information that's just compounding every day, almost exponentially. So it's kind of difficult to stay on top of all of these new developments. So with this, I hope that was a decent overview, but I'll like to thank you all for having me here. And right here, this is a picture of me with some of my NIH colleagues, as well as some of my colleagues from Korea. This is Seoul National University Hospital, where we were able to start the ACT trial back in March, before the US was even under lockdown or anything like that. So with that, I will end, and please let me know if there are any questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you very much for a great overview, Jeanne. Very much appreciated. While people write questions in the chat, I wanted to ask you, the phase 2 and phase 3 trials that are planned, are they planning to actually, because I know there's an ethical dilemma in how those trials are being designed, in terms of infecting voluntarily patients who receive the vaccine or the placebo, versus just vaccinating versus placebo vaccinating individuals, and just wait for them to develop or not the disease in the real world. So anything you can tell us about the design of the ongoing trial?
That's a really good question. I think it's a really interesting question as well, because as we all know, there are so many people who can be asymptomatic or paucisymptomatic and so on and so forth, especially people who are pretty young and otherwise healthy. But there are plenty of young and healthy people who also get severely ill as well. So I don't know I'm not really quite on top of all of that discussion, but it's a fascinating question, to be quite honest, because it might be difficult to really tell with 100% certainty how effective a vaccine would be otherwise.
Thank you very much to our speakers and participants for your questions, and thank you to the speakers for your generosity to share and sometimes in real time the results of your research. Very much appreciated. We are going to conclude the session today. The two speakers who did not have time to talk will talk in 2 weeks with our next session. So they will have even more data to present. Thank you very much, and see you in 2 weeks.